Hello. So just yesterday I published a video about whether you should learn to code or to prompt. And in there I was arguing that, yeah, you could perfectly well learn to code with the help of ChatGPT. For example, there are other tools meant right now, but as I'm working with ChatGPT, I'll keep it to ChatGPT. And in the work that I did between creating that video and publishing it, I ran into some problems in my code that actually, yeah, I think are a bit of a counter argument to what I was saying about learning to code with the help of ChatGPT. And yes and no, but I'm actually running into problems where the lack of following design patterns and best practice and stuff like that um, is creating all kinds of problems for me. And the way I use ChatGPT and until now, I just asked it about, like I said, I asked it a pretty stupid question, basic questions, and write some example code for me and stuff, etc., etc. I was screening up my code and trying to apply some things that I learned, especially when doing voiceover for my other videos. And yeah, I was going to clean up a bit, I changed some things, and I did. And quickly enough, I ran into the limitations of my knowledge again. But then I continued to, in one of my videos from before, I was working on a select tile method, a way to select tiles towards the placement of my first unit, to be able to place a unit on a selected tile. And so I continued a bit of that in when I was messing around with my code. And therein I ran into all kinds of problems that kind of show the limitations of doing what I do with ChatGPT, and which confirms a bit with some programmers said that I read on the thread I was kind of commenting on with my video about learning to code or to prompt, that said, yeah, you can, when you're just using ChatGPT, you cannot really write code if you don't know anything about programming, code that works. The code might work, but if you don't really know what you're doing, you will run into problems later on inside of concerning security or scalability, or any kinds of adding new functionalities to your code, to your program, etc., etc. And in my video, I kind of argumented that you will run into that eventually, and you will have to learn more about it. And that's the point where I am at with not just something that can be solved by having some code that makes it work. Because one thing I learned that is you can do all kinds of things in at least 100 different ways in programming. But if I'm running into the fact that my code lacks any kind of structure, any kind of design, respects any design pattern, and even if I don't respect known design patterns that for myself, I don't even have a design philosophy for everything that I created. It's just a bit of thrown together code that I made work, and with the help of ChatGPT recently made work with its help. But let me explain more in detail what's going on. So I'm so reduce my image a bit. I have this hierarchy of classes that create the board elements, the tiles, in fact, and some other elements on the board that I use to construct a board. And in the hierarchy, I have two abstract classes where all the other board element objects are defined in subclasses. I have a kind of a tree there, which also might be what is it called? Might be need to refute a bit, but basically seems to be an all right way of doing things. But in there, so I have one shape class that's the superclass of it all. Then below it, I have a board element class, which is the superclass of the tiles and the hexagon and also the board pieces later on, the units and buildings, etc. And in there, I have Boolean is highlighted, which takes an point parameter, and when the which is the cursor point, the cursor. When the cursor is in that shape, it sets this boolean to true, and then the object or the shape is highlighted. But this will highlight any shape. It was actually for highlighting tiles, and well, if you might have seen my other videos about the grid, etc., it actually highlights any shape that I draw on the screen. So it's kind of useful sometimes for even highlighting shapes that later on I don't want to draw that I want to be invisible. That's like my grid. The grid hexagon is just a helper object to hold the tiles. But it's kind of handy. But I have implemented on the object niveau, I've implemented a functionality that always highlights these shapes. And I thought that was pretty smart and very happy that it worked, etc. But then I'm trying to retrieve information from tiles that I highlight or that I click on. And so I was already in another video, I was messing around a bit, and I was convinced that it would be pretty simple because that my highlight function is that simple, etc. But yeah, while doing all this, I ran into all kinds of problems, and I had a lot of back and forth with ChatGPT about those things, which also led me to ask more general questions about the way I'm doing things, etc. And then ChatGPT already gave me some hints in the sense of design patterns, etc. And then at a certain point here, it advises me to look into design patterns such as model view controller to help structure application. And then I go on, I try all kinds of things here in my user interface, selecting the tiles, etc., etc., etc. But and then at some point it indicates to me that I have my mouse input handler, mouse event handler, etc., inside my draw canvas, which happens in my user interface. Yeah, at a certain point it advises me to separate those two, and also making reference to design principles. So I ran into more of those kinds of problems all over. And as it made reference to this MVC design pattern, and later on, again, it tells me about those things because I ask more general questions. So I start to notice that there is a problem with these kinds of things in my code, that I mix all kinds of things together, which, what I understand, isn't always a problem if you know what you're doing and why you're doing that. Because one thing that ChatGPT keeps reminding me of is that it depends on your preferences, it depends on your situation, on your project, it depends on a lot of things. So I'm trying to ask it a bit about those general things. Wouldn't it be better to do this or do that or such and so? And sometimes it said, yeah, it might be better to, like, for instance, I talk about this also in my board element class where I have that highlight function. I have a draw board element. It's actually kind of a rendering method. So at a certain moment, I'm asking ChatGPT if it wouldn't be better to where the rendering is done, and then it kind of confirms that would be more in line with some design principles. And then again, it ends with, however, always consider the specific needs and requirements of your project when making design decisions. The most important thing is that your code is easy to understand, maintain, and extend. If the current structure achieves this goal, it may not be necessary to change it. So yeah, it keeps telling me those kinds of things, and so I say thank you, but I'm a beginner and learning, and I like to learn about design patterns and best practice, although I already know that most depends on a specific situation. And that's something I find in all kinds of professions, all kinds of activities that we have in life. You can have in a lot of domains, there's 100 different ways of doing things, 100 possible different way of doing things, and it all depends on it depends on your preferences, the situation, etc., etc. But you have to be quite proficient in that domain to make those kinds of decisions. So when ChatGPT tells me that you have to consider the specific needs and requirements of your project when making design decisions, I'm like, yeah, but okay, I cannot make those decisions if I don't have any knowledge of them. So when I replied with I want to learn, although I know this and that, it gives me a whole list of 8 different design patterns. And so yeah, reading that learns me globally learns me a bit, and it has said multiple times. What did it say about separating? What was it? The principle? Oh, the first one, the single responsibility principle. Try to make a class that does one thing or one reason to change. Blah blah blah. What means a class should only have one job or responsibility. That it has told me that multiple times. But I also took its advice to read up a bit. So I typed MVC in Google, and one of the first results was a book about design patterns, specifically in the context of game design. So I've read that. I've read a bit in there, the first chapter where the author explains a few of those design patterns that ChatGPT talks about here as well. And so far already, I have already understood enough that it's now totally clear why I run into a wall at this point in my code, because that I want to be able to select a tile, and it implies all those things. Until now, I was just mostly creating objects to construct a board, etc. And I just recently started implementing a game loop and well, especially that, and trying to put a unit on a certain tile. That is where I actually run into the difference of, like it says in the model view controller pattern, for example, which I understand. It's just a way of doing things in certain situations, and there's a million opinions about the 100 different ways of doing things. That's I understand, but I'm pretty sensitive to design principles, and I'd like to create a structured thing and have some. Yeah, I like to learn to do it the right way, do it a way that's neat, and while learning it, I want to be able to do things in a nice way, in a solid way. So with the little that I know now about these design patterns, etc., and separation of different parts of your code, I completely understand why I run into a wall now trying to select a tile and put something on there. Because now, for the first time, I have my objects. I have my objects. I have what is on the screen, and I want to interact with what is on the screen. And that interaction should translate into something that happens to the objects and the creation of other objects. So yeah, there I run into a wall conceptually, and with the lack of structure in my code. And I also run into, to return to the subject, I also run into into the limitations of what you can do with ChatGPT or another AI help. And despite that it gives me hints and advice, it did give me advice to read up on, for example, the model view controller pattern, which I did, so that's very good. So in that sense, in my other video, I was right about, yeah, you run into a problem, and then when you're curious and you want to learn, you will find solutions. But what I also can clearly see is that here is a limitation of ChatGPT, in the sense that it's hard already basically to give it all the context of all my classes. In reality, I have very little code yet. So I could even, I think, post all my classes, at least the classes that are different enough to merit being posted. I could post most of my classes in the chat, and I think it wouldn't even be bigger than the context it can use. So which, for instance, in this conversation here, I have a lot of that. And one time it gave me an answer, and I was like, "Oh, I think you didn't read my code." So I asked it to, "Can you please read the 4 classes that I posted before in this conversation?" And then it did. Took a while, and then it gave me an adapted answer. So, but yeah, when your program is much bigger, of course, that will become a problem already. Even with, yeah, you can circumvent it with the API, and other people are making all kinds of things that circumvents those limitations. And I think there are also tools you can use in your IDE that can see the whole context, but then still, maybe I'm wrong, but so there's ways to get the whole context in there, but then still, I doubt it very much that the ChatGPT, for example, or other tools are capable of, from your code, distilling your design philosophy in their answers. Probably because it's like a predictive model, it can continue or what the way you're doing things. So probably that will be okay. But the way I use it, just post a class and give me some code, etc. Already a lot of it, even with my limited knowledge, I'm like, no, that's not the kind of answer I'm looking for. That's not how I do things, or that's the way of doing it that goes beyond my understanding. So I want a way that resembles more what I already know, for example. But that will be, a lot of times you will have a limited context. But what I see as a more glaring problem here is that, yeah, when you talk about taking decisions concerning design patterns, etc., I don't see these language models do that for you. And like where I am now, I have to learn myself about those things. Otherwise, even if I could prime ChatGPT in the sense that I say use this or that design pattern, I still myself I have to come up with how am I going um, how am I going to structure my code? What Yeah, when it comes to choosing what design pattern, design principle, whatever you want to use, you take in account your firstly your own preferences already, and then what you're trying to create, and then maybe what you want to do with it later. Maybe security concerns. What depends what you're using it for. Is it online? Is it this or that? What? And I might, in theory, you might even be able to explain all that to a ChatGPT or an LLM. But yeah, I seriously doubt that this kind of decisions can be made by it. And even then, I mostly what I understand now is that what other programmers are saying, yeah, when you don't know a bit about all these things, it's very hard to create some kind of serious piece of software that actually works, that is maintainable, etc., and that has that's a coherent thing. Like I already read in that book, that you can all kinds of things that may be not considered best practice in certain situations, they're perfectly fine because that's the most simple or logical way to do a thing that in another context would lead to all kinds of problems. So, and when I'm reading all those things, yeah, I'm very much conscious that I have uh, zero idea what I'm doing, and yeah, that I need to learn a lot about all those kinds of things, and yeah, especially for some theoretical thing like reading up about a bunch of design patterns. It's very useful to have some author explain to you uh, one pattern next to the other, how they relate to one another, what are the what the differences are, etc., in some kind of a coherent fashion. And like here, ChatGPT gives me all these examples, and I could ask it almost indefinitely to go into more detail about all these things and explain them to me. And I certainly will, or while I'm working, to explain more better explain these things. And the power is that when it sees my code, it can use my code to illustrate some of these things. But then at a certain point, it seems to get more efficient to have them written down in a book and read about them in a coherent fashion. If you want to have if you want to build a theoretical understanding of those things, have a framework of those principles, it starts to look, for me at least, more efficient to read something about that somebody wrote and assembled and made into a coherent a coherent body of text to help you understand. So yeah, so what I was saying in my other video, that it is perfect to help you learn to code as well. This is a big but, in the sense that but if you're really serious about learning, you'd probably at certain point read up and use some other resources to faster and better understand some principles. And having said that, I think that ChatGPT does a pretty good job on advising some of the things, and sometimes annoyingly repeating that it all depends on your preference and the code and that. But yeah, that's a pretty important point. That I'm learning about code when I'm reading about it, and what I also learned in other domains of work, etc. It really depends. And a lot of times, the method you choose really depends on a lot of factors. So there's hardly ever any clear-cut answers, and that's what, what you learn when you become more proficient in any domain, making that kind of decisions and being able to analyze a certain situation, certain demands, etc., and make decisions in that regard. Hopefully, good decisions. But also, when you realize that your decisions weren't that good, you can change them because you know there are other options to do things. So that was what I wanted to add to my other TED talk about learning to code or learning to prompt. I think it's quite ironic that right after that video, I ran into these problems that clearly outline the limitations of what I'm doing with ChatGPT, and still in some way it also does help me learn. But it's not only through through asking stupid questions to ChatGPT. And I really understand the value of what programmers are saying, that they can be much more specific in what they ask of ChatGPT, so it can give much more useful answers to a specific use case. And I really noticed that I can ask some code or something for a specific thing, and I ask it another time, it gives another way of doing it, and it just mixes the ways of doing things. It just mixes it up because I don't specify any way of doing things. So that's kind of funny. But it's very interesting. It's in the same time, although it seems to be a limitation, at the same time it's very enlightening also, because it does show, at least to me, I'm willing to learn, it does show that there are many different ways of doing stuff. And now I'm beginning to understand that it is good to understand all those different ways, and that also for my code I need to create some kind of an architecture, and I have to watch out that I don't lose myself in trying to create the perfect architecture, because I must take care that my OCD doesn't take the upper hand. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, I have a tendency want to be perfectionist. So yeah, but I already understand it depends. And like I said, my code base is still very small, so I can try things out, and if it doesn't work, I can change it up, etc. So and all this trying out helps me a lot to learn as well. Uh, like in my last footage, I'm trying to do things and I'm messing things up. I'm breaking everything. I changed so many things now that even my simple highlight function that was basically coded in the objects doesn't work anymore. So because I was messing around with the user interface class where I have the rendering windows, etc. But yeah, trying to move things around, breaking everything, and then understanding and then making it work again, and understanding why it didn't work and why it does work again when you fix it. That's all very enlightening. So yeah, but it doesn't. It's not enough to just ask ChatGPT to write you code solutions for every problem that you encounter. That's for sure. That will very quickly create an unmanageable heap of code. And I noticed that yeah, it can give me code that might be correct, but it very quickly loses the context of one question to the next. Even within one chat, it quickly loses the context. So I haven't tried. I don't know how to do that. I haven't tried yet to give it a whole context, explain what you want to do, and let it write all the code. Some people do get. I've read that people get a long way with that kind of approach, but that's not what I've tried so far. So far, I wouldn't know how to do it either, and it's not really what interests me anyway. I want to create my own code and learn how it all works and etc. So now I run into the architecture of my code. So and the lack thereof, obviously. So that was my little rant about that. Thanks for watching, and bye bye.